apparently. Number 10 in the countdown. The Christian view of women in ancient Roman society came in and, like the religion itself, quashed the pagan beliefs preceding them. Pagan times in Rome weren't a merry old good time for women, don't get me wrong, but they had more rights and respect when there was a whole pantheon of women gods whose tempers were to be revered and feared by every Roman man. But then they convert and answer to one god who was depicted as a soul man, making it, pun intended, a man's world. In the 4th century AD, the Andrew Tate of ancient Rome, Saint Jerome, set the standard on how you should perceive and treat women around you. If your wife has a bad temper, or if she's stupid, or if she has a birthmark, or if she's haughty, or if she has a foul breath, you'll only learn these things after marriage. You always have to tell her how beautiful she looks. If you so much as look at another woman, she feels rejected. You have to bow down before her and call her my lady, and you mustn't forget her birthday. It's worse if she's pretty than if she's ugly, because then you have to constantly be on your guard. Honestly, try and tell me you can't picture some old Roman bald dude in a toga, like white beard, one of those stupid teak tables, wearing the oversized podcast headphones, saying that exact tirade while like Joe Rogan is sitting across from nodding like, yeah man, yeah, that's what's up. Hey dude, kinda makes sense that you're only gonna find out about her personality after you married her, when y'all don't even know each other when you get married and you bought her at a bride auction like she's a cow for your farm. So, according to St. Jerome, it was better to be alone with God than in the company of a woman. Guess God is a woman, because he was found in bed having an affair with a married one. Oopsies, hypocrite. Do you want to learn more about hypocrisy in the past? Because there's a ton of it. Subscribe to The Hive to see our regularly released history videos. Alrighty, that was a beautiful segue into number 9, the discussion of how women in ancient Rome could be worshipped but never equal. As stated, while Roman society may have been dominated by men, their original godly pantheon was anything but. They bowed to powerful women, begging for mercy or pleasure from their female goddesses. Part of the appeal of Christianity was bowing to a woman no longer. They finally became obsolete, powerless. But they were anything but powerless in the era of Roman paganism. Of the 3 supreme deities worshipped by ancient Romans, only one, Jupiter, the king of gods, was male. The other 2 were Juno, the chief goddess and protectress of the empire, and Minerva, Jupiter's daughter, the goddess of wisdom and war. The Vestal Virgins, aka priestesses of Vesta, were ranked among the city's most important residents, having been appointed to this role before puberty, remaining chaste for the next 30 years of their lives. These 6 virginal women held sacred duties like preserving the hearth fire in Vesta's temple, as it was believed if the fire died, so would Rome. That's a pretty serious job. They also had the most important duties in the kingdom, such as safeguarding the wills of the wealthiest and most prominent Romans, such as Julius Caesar himself, because women were more trustworthy than men, but they weren't to be trusted. Okay, anyway, the priestesses' religious significance gave them unusual power and influence, and they occasionally used it, as when they intervened to save the young Caesar from the dictator Sulla. This worship of women and deifying them into earthly roles such as the Vestals had been the saving grace of women's rights in the horrifically male-centric Roman society. Unfortunately, as said, it was swept away in the name of man. Okay, a break from sad lady facts. For number 8, let's cover warrior women. Yeah, now that's more like it. So, from the northernmost tip of the border with Asia, plenty of ancient European armies were happy to welcome women into their ranks. But historians always agree upon one exception, where the army and navy were almost 99.9% men. Can you guess who it is from the title of the video? Women may have been banned legally from joining the army, but your average Roman soldier would have seen their fair share of female combatants, as well as their own women on the home front. Professor Valentine J. Belfiglio shared that Roman women were capable of close combat as well. Not only were they frequent competitors in gladiatorial shows, but they, like the women of the clans fighting against the invading Romans, were known to take up arms in warfare, albeit in a non-official, unsanctioned capacity. History tells of a few of these women, such as Cloelia, who in 506 BCE freed herself and 20 others from the Etruscan camp and swam them home through enemy spears. For her courage, the Romans erected a bronze equestrian statue with the heroine seated upon it. Belfiglio notes, on the highest point along the sacred way. When the Carthaginian general Hannibal was invading, women and men inhabitants fought valiantly, and they burned his siege engines together. Hannibal would later face and lose to the honored Busa, who aided Roman fugitives from his war regime. So, in summary, women may have been banned legally from joining the army, but your average Roman soldier would have battled against and sometimes besides women despite that. The name game! It's number 7 in the countdown, women, like a lazy boy chair, an ice maker, or owning a cat, were possessions in ancient Rome. And so, like the college roommate who complained if you moved their toaster 2 inches to the left, they put their name on it. Not in a label maker fashion, more so in a recycle fashion. From the moment of their birth, women were viewed under male authority. Therefore, the name of a baby girl would be close to her father's. For example, Claudius may have a daughter named Claudia. Augustus becomes Augusta. Constantine, Constantina. Okay, so maybe the rule was just whatever the last letter was, swap it to an A. Ironically, this is why a lot of women's names end with an sound. Talk about making historical waves, seeing as our society still inherently perceives names with that ending as sounding feminine. As the empire grew older, women in the ancient Rome were granted more freedom, often by sheer number of children they bore. 3 children could allow a woman to become independent. Independence meant no more naming your kids after their dad, which isn't fair anyways because I'm sorry, but who carried this kid for 12 months and then had to push it out? Thus, daughters started being named after goddesses, their mothers, their aunts, and plants. Anyways, number 6, once you were old enough for baby time, you were married off, and when that happened, you donned a stola. In my recent video, the top 10 messed up marriage traditions in ancient Rome, I explained the Roman marriage ceremony and also the garb worn. The flamium was an egg yolk yellow veil worn by brides that they would lift from their face and hair in preparations for vows, to instead fall down on their shoulders and biceps. This placement of the veil signifies her donning the stola. The stola was a type of long overlay. Sometimes it was in the form of a dress itself, but oftentimes it was an additional soft and light drape of material. It was worn by married and respectable women and was also associated with modesty. For those who could afford it, a stola with decorations around its neckline was available. This trim could be patterns, embroidery, beads, and motifs. When initially introduced, the stola was a preserve for the upper-class patrician women in the early republic. But over time, the right and then the absolute expectation to wear it extended to the lower-class women. The pala, a rectangular shawl, was also worn over it as a cloak and draped over the left shoulder. Any women who were convicted of adultery or were working girls or actresses were forbidden to wear a stola in public.
Number 5, foot binding in China. Foot binding was a traditional practice in China that involved tightly binding the feet of young girls to prevent normal growth and create small, delicate feet. This practice, which lasted for centuries, had profound cultural, social, and physical implications. The origins of foot binding are not entirely clear, but it is believed to have emerged during the Song dynasty and became widespread during the Ming and Qing dynasty. Foot binding was considered a symbol of beauty and social status. Small bound feet were associated with its feminine grace and delicacy, as it was seen as a mark of a woman's commitment to cultural norms and societal expectations. The bound foot had erotic connotations in Chinese culture, and the practice was linked to a concept of lotus feet. The process of foot binding was often fetishized, and the sight of a woman unbinding her feet was considered intimate. Ew. Social reformers, missionaries, and women's rights activists played a key role in campaigning against foot binding. The practice was finally officially banned in 1912 after the fall of the Qing dynasty, although it does still continue in some areas for a period. Number 4, banning women on voting. Bans on women voting, also known as the women's suffrage restrictions, were historical practices that denied women the right to participate in political elections and vote. Such restrictions were widespread and persisted in various countries, such as much of history in the 19th and early 20th century saw the emergence of women's suffrage movements advocating for equal voting rights. Activists argue that women, like men, should have the right to participate in democratic processes. The Seneca Falls Convention in the United States in 1848 is often considered the starting point of the women's suffrage movement. At the convention, attendees, including prominent figures like Elizabeth Cady Stanton and Lucretia Mott, discussed the need for women's rights, including the right to vote. The aftermath of World War I saw changes in the suffrage laws in various countries. In 1918, the United Kingdom passed the Representations of People's Act granting voting rights to certain women, and the US ratification of the 19th Amendment in 1920, enfranchising American women. Over time, women's suffrage became a global movement, and many countries progressively extended voting rights to women. The mid-20th century saw a shift towards universal suffrage, where voting rights were not restricted based on gender. Number 3, limitation on jury services. Limitation on jury services historically for women were common in many jurisdictions, reflecting prevailing gender norms and societal expectations about women's roles. Such limitations often took the form of legal restrictions or cultural bases that excluded or restricted women's participation in jury duty. In some common law traditions, which include legal systems in countries like the United Kingdom and the United States, women were historically excluded or had limited participations in jury services. This exclusion was based on traditional views of women's roles as caregivers, and they perceived the lack of qualifications for legal decision making or critical thinking. Women's rights advocates and suffragists challenges these exclusions, arguing that women were fully capable of serving as impartial jurors. In the 20th century, legal reforms aimed at dismantling gender-based barriers began to take effect. Legal challenges based on the principle of equal protection under the laws played a role in striking down gender-based exclusions. Courts began to recognize that excluding women from jury service solely based on their gender violated principles of equality and fairness. Despite legal reforms, challenges relating to gender-based biases in jury selections and other systematic issues persist. Efforts continue to address barriers to equal representation on jurors and to ensure diversity and fairness in the judicial system. Number 2, modesty laws. Modesty laws, referred to as the regulations or dress codes that prescribed a certain standard of modesty in public attire. These laws are often influenced by cultural, religious, or societal norms that seek to regulate clothing choices in alliance with a perceived standard of decency. If you ever heard or seen in regards to dress codes, they are also in an alliance in some sort of modesty forums made in certain spaces. Various societies have implemented dress codes or modesty laws that dictate acceptable clothing in public spaces. These codes may specify the length of skirts and the coverage of shoulders or wearing the head's covering. In some parts of Southeast Asia, if your hair is too long, your teachers actually somehow have the right to cut your hair short. In the US, if you do show your shoulders as a young girl, you could be asking for it. It's truly insane the limitations of these so-called dress codes of control of how one's dressed, no matter the context, is still apparent. Even in women's choices to wear the hijab, and laws in France as well in Quebec have limited or fully banned religious wear like the niqab or burqa when it comes to a woman who actually wants to wear it. Regardless what a person chooses to wear, just mind your damn business. And finally, number 1, restrictions on education. Throughout history, women have faced various restrictions on education with limited access to formal learning opportunities. These restrictions were often rooted in societal norms, traditional gender roles, and discriminatory beliefs about women's intellectual capabilities. These restrictions were often rooted in societal norms, traditional gender roles, and discriminatory beliefs about women's intellectual capabilities. Women were frequently excluded from institutions of higher learning. Universities and colleges were historically male-dominated, and women faced significant barriers to enrollment. When they were admitted, their choices of study were often limited to certain suitable fields. For example, Ruth Bader Ginsburg had mentioned during her studies at Harvard, it was a very rare few amount of women were allowed into these highly academic spaces, only to be challenged why were they there when a man should have been there instead. Restrictions on women's educations were not limited to any specific region or culture. Different societies impose on varying degrees of restrictions, and progress towards gender-inclusive education has occurred at different rates around the world. While progress has been made, challenges to women's education persist in some regions. Factors such as poverty, cultural norms, and gender-based violence can be impeded access to education for girls and women. As an example, Malala Yousafzai is one of who's personally experienced violence for advocating for education for women. But thankfully, with her survival and recovery, her activism still persists in encouraging and inspiring women everywhere to strive for education.
Satan's ladies. Back in the Dark Ages, women were very much oppressed and incredibly misunderstood. Honestly, if one is to look at the percentage of women who were and weren't accused of witchcraft, and just how easy it was to, quote unquote, prove a woman was a witch, the data is very much skewed. Granted, I'm not about to jump into generalized witch hunt torment right this moment, so bear with me. So back in the Dark Ages, some folks thought that women were Satan's incarnate, and ergo were predisposed to sin, and therefore, by that logic, they had to be witches. Trust me, I know the common sense was missing from that statement. There were 4 reasons why women were considered to be part of the devil's posse, if you will. For starters, it was believed that women were foolish and gullible, which is why they turned to magic. Yeah, that hurt my brain to say. Number 2, because women are insatiable when it comes to carnal pleasures, they seek out help from the devil to satiate their needs. I can think of better ways, but alright. Number 3, women talk a lot and allegedly speak lies because we talk too much. Great, I'm already classifying myself as a witch. Finally, women are weak, and the only way we can seek revenge is by using magic powers and spells. Pardon me, I can feel my brain leaking out of my ears. Sadly, that was the reality back then, because having a personality and independence meant, game over. Number 9, interrogation tactics. So what happens if you do get accused of being a witch, or, Satan's wifey? Time to go through the witch trials, which is a polite way of saying sentenced to torment until you either confessed or someone found proof by ways of a certain marking on your body. Let's talk about one of the most agonizing methods of torment, shall we? If you're, femme presenting and get arrested for something serious and the townspeople want information out of you, they drag you into a dungeon, strip you until you're in the nude, tie a rope around each one of your ankles and hoist you up so that you're upside down with your legs spread apart, and once again in your birthday suit, so probably shivering in the cold. Now here comes the most horrifying part of the whole thing. You know those saws that folks use to cut down trees? Specifically the really big ones that tend to take 2 folks to use? So one of those would be used to slice you in half from the rear to the head. Easily one of the most painful ways that you could go, in my opinion. The wild thing about the saw is that it wasn't originally made for trees and then used on people. It's actually the other way around. Pardon me, I'll be shuddering for the rest of today. Number 8, that time of the month. Ant Flow, the Red Sea, Shark Week. Heck, the event has so many monikers, but those who experience it can agree that it's a pretty miserable period of time. Back in the day, folks didn't have the same kinds of resources that we have in today's age, so a lot of people really had to get creative. They would use rags or other linens to fashion, a pad, but underwear wasn't all that popular yet, so they had to find a way to keep things in, place. Some folks would fashion a makeshift medieval tampon of sorts where they would wrap cotton fabric around a twig, which sounds super uncomfortable if you ask me. Other folks would seek out bog moss because it was remarkably absorbent, and funny enough the name BLOOD moss became synonymous with it because of its use of treating wounds and in period products. If you didn't have access to those things, some folks would simply resort to wearing red the whole time so everything just sort of blended in. I love the lazy approach. Makes sense to me. Number 7, a ban on stripes. Might as well touch a little more on some dark age fashion rules. We've all met somebody in our lives who's way too concerned with what other people are wearing, but back in the dark ages, you actually risk the possibility of coming across some very real fashion police who are actually able to issue a fine should your fashion choices not be of the local dress code. I'm in trouble. Sometimes it wasn't even just a fine. Some serious fashion faux pas could actually lead to your imprisonment or even your death. Stripes were definitely a main culprit in these times, since striped clothing was seen as a garment of the devil. Okay, I'm good. If you need evidence, because I know that sounds wild. Specifically in 1310 in a French town, there was a local cobbler who was put to death because he'd been caught in striped clothing. Not only were members of the clergy not exempt from this rule, since they were pretty highly ranked at the time, but now there were animals. Poor zebras. They were referred to as the beasts of the devil. I'm so glad that's something that's faded with time. Number 6, quickie wedding. I'm sure we all know at least one couple that got married way too quickly in our opinion, but thankfully in today's modern age, it's relatively painless to end that, if things go bad. Heck, drive-through wedding chapels are a thing nowadays and have been for quite some time. Well, so marriage in the dark ages was quick and easy, but also kind of difficult to prove. If you and your loved one really wanted to get married, all you had to do was say, "We're married," and then, it's legal. Of course, this led to a whole pile of spur-of-the-moment type marriages, especially considering how schmex before marriage was widely condemned at the time. While I'm sure many people who are divorced would have preferred if their marriages were this easy, this led to people, of course, taking advantage of this difficult-to-prove thing. Women, in particular, were at risk of getting hitched to a man who might want to take you as his wife for the night, but then the following day, after getting what he wants, he'd deny ever agreeing to the union y'all had. This is why many women tried to get at least one witness to the union, just in case. Nowadays, I believe at least 2 witnesses are needed for the marriage certificate, but feel free to correct me if I'm wrong.
Number 5, Walk of Shame. Remember in Game of Thrones when Cersei Lannister was made to do the Walk of Shame? Yeah, that is a real thing that happened to women in history. The scold's bridle was also sometimes made to be worn by women who were then paraded through the town and in said mask just to humiliate them further. And there's a few different things people would parade people in town with, but the mask is one of them. No, as if just being forced to wear that mask wasn't awful enough. I don't think you need to parade someone around or chain them to a fireplace. I think you can just leave it at the mask, to be honest. Your point would be made. In fact, I don't even think you need the mask at all. Just don't try to make a point to begin with and then we're all good. How about instead we just let women exist and be heard? Just a thought from a woman who's living in 2023, ye old past. Talking to you, past, back there. Yikes. Number 4, hand clamps. Honestly, this sounds like one of the most horrific and worst things I've heard of. It might not sound bad to people, but I don't know. I just imagined what this would be like and I was like, that's horrifying. This method of torment was popular during the feudal period of China. It was used all the way up till the 19th century. What did it involve? Forcing women to put their hands into a tool that would then squeeze the tip of their finger. Doesn't sound that bad when you're thinking of it on the surface level, and in terms of the surface area of your finger. But this pain was actually so bad because of the pressure that it would cause many to just pass out. But once you passed out, they would just splash some cold water on you and force you to stay awake so you could experience every single second of pain awake. It wasn't reserved for just the hands or fingers either. There were also tools like this used to apply pressure to the feet and the head even of suspected offenders. Yeah, this method of course wasn't even safe for people who were convicted of adultery, which honestly I don't even think you should torment people physically like this anyways, or mentally. Even if they're guilty of it, like, let's just be adults and move on. It was used on both guilty and innocent folks. I am sure, I'm 100% positive. All you had to do was be suspected of adultery for this brutal form of punishment to be administered. So you don't even need any, I mean, back then, I don't even think people had proof. They were just like, I have a feeling, so do something terrible to this woman. Number 3, ducking stool. Despite being more well known for its use during witch trials, the ducking stool was also something that was used to torment women in the 19th century as well. In fact, documentation of its use exists from as late as 1896. That seems pretty late to me. That's wild. Although I obviously wasn't alive at that time and it was over 100 years ago now, it does not feel that long ago relative to our history and time spent on this earth. Oh boy. A ducking stool was basically a chair, a variation of another stool type used to humiliate people. However, in the case of the ducking stool, you were more than humiliated, you could actually die. Women would be tied to the ducking stool, basically a chair, and then lowered into the water. During the witch trials, this was one of the methods used to discern witches from innocent women. The problem being that witches would apparently survive the process thanks to their wily powers, whereas women would be proclaimed innocent if they could not float, swim, or survive this process, meaning that many that were then deemed innocent wouldn't survive the ducking process. So it seems like a flawed way to test that, you know what I mean? Like if someone's innocent, I feel like they shouldn't end up dead, but I don't know. Only the witches get to live, and even then they don't get to live. No one gets to live. Are you a woman? No life for you. Sorry. You just gotta move on. That's history for you. Number 2, foot binding. While not a punishment for any misdeed, foot binding was a cultural practice that has often been tied to sexist ideals for women that were created not necessarily by them, but by like society at large. The idea with foot binding was to break the bones of young girls' feet so that their feet could be shaped into a small and dainty size. From a young age, their feet were broken, bound, and conditioned so that they would be and remain small into adulthood. While no longer something practiced today, foot binding is an ancient practice that is believed to have originated somewhere around the 10th century. The decline began though around the mid-19th century. That's 9 centuries of foot binding, after questions were raised about the practice in the 18th century. Number 1, nose cutting. Probably one of the most brutal punishments out there for suspected adultery or promiscuity is the method of nose and ear cutting. This is when women have their noses and or their ears removed. This is done to disfigure the woman and take away the power of her beauty as punishment for whatever misdeed she's accused of. In many cases, women have been punished in this way without even actually being proven to have done anything that is even deemed wrong by whatever moral code you're subscribing to, by whatever whack moral code you are subscribing to. Some women have even been punished this way simply for defending or protecting themselves or others. Typically, nose cutting is reserved as a punishment for women. It happened not just in the 19th century, but before and even after that as well.
Punishment number 10 is ash bath. Just saying medieval times doesn't actually mean much. Every empire and kingdom had its own respective medieval time at different times than one another. So, Persia spanned from the 6th century to the 15th century, during which time they concocted some truly heinous punishments for those who did wrong, or at least those who did wrong in the eyes of whatever crazy leader was in charge at the time. Setting the stage for long-suffering death everywhere, Persia introduced such styles as forcing people to drink molten gold, tearing people apart with trees, and drowning them in ash. This punishment was one of the worst deaths you could receive, reserved for the worst criminals and those guilty of high treason or offenses against the gods, and it was horrifying. It consisted of throwing a victim into a 75-foot tower filled with ashes. You'd break a couple of bones, but it was a soft landing. From outside the tower, large hand cranks were spun by a team of men, sending the ashes flying and disrupting the solid pile so that the victim was pushed deeper and deeper down the tower, suffocating on burnt ash until they drowned in it. If you dipped your toes in the Bible, you may know there's quite a few people that got this sentence in there, such as a corrupt Jewish priest whose family isn't allowed to bury his remains with a bunch of sassy snaps added. However, the concubines caught planning coups against their leader on several occasions met this fate too. Punishment number 9 is the evil field. So medieval Rome is characterized by the break with Constantinople and the formation of the Papal State, with technically ongoing until its collapse, which marks the beginning of Europe's medieval period. On the topic of being buried buried while still breathing, the Romans also enjoyed dumping people into holes alive in their medieval times. One famous example is the Vestal Virgins, the priestesses of the hearth goddess Vesta who were sworn to chastity. However, should they break that chastity vow, they had a special acre of grass dedicated just to burying them alive. Like most deaths, Romans like to make a big show of it, and the Vestal breaking her virginity vow would naturally be the Sunday matinee. They had an entire little ritual. She'd be carried on a litter throughout the city in the nude until they reached the Campus Secularis, aka the Evil Field. There, an underground chamber awaited in which she'd be lowered into and sealed inside alive. There was only one ever known instance in Roman history where a Vestal Virgin wasn't slain for breaking her vows. That would be Julia Aquilia Severa, the wife, then ex-wife, then wife again, of Emperor Elagabalus. It's believed that Julia remained with him until they were killed in the year 222, but who's to say they put Julia in the ground after. Punishment number 8 is the finger cinch. China's medieval period was between the fall of the Han Dynasty in 220 CE and the fall of the Mongol Dynasty in 1368 CE. Famous in the Chinese feudal dynasty, this form of punishment was specifically made for the woman who did not obey her master's command. Master can be taken literally, should it be a concubine or a servant, but also figuratively like her parents or husband. The offenders have to put their fingers inside a specialized tool which look like interlocking combs. The device would then squeeze the fingertips, causing immense pain and loss of circulation. If the victim faints, ice water would be thrown on her as a wake-up call. The punishment would continue until the victim was deprived of all their strength. The device was prepared in every shape and size to crush the fingers of any female, so she may ultimately surrender to male prejudice. Punishment number 7 is the four witnesses. The Ottoman Empire was born very shortly, around 100 years at most, before the European medieval period started. As stated, it began when Rome broke from Constantinople, and thus it finished alongside the other European nations in the 16th century. How they punish adultery is akin to many cultures. Man cheats, no punishment. Woman cheats, world must be ending. The Ottoman criminal code did not distinguish between fornication and adultery. Zina was the word used for both, and both were unacceptable from a woman of any kind. And when caught in an alleged act of zina, in order to ensure the women were not wrongfully accused, the accusers required to produce 4 witnesses of good standing that actually observed the act of intercourse as it was happening. Imagine that. You walk in on your wife in bed with your best friend. So you have to run yelling into the streets for 4 people to come right now and see them while they're still hurriedly dressing, so you have some chance of getting her punished. However, even if you do manage to pull off 4 witnesses, if the witnesses can't be found at the time of the woman's trial, then the accusing husband will be flogged 80 stripes and ignored. So what I'm hearing is, as a cheating wife, you could essentially make the little problem go away if these 4 witnesses were to, I don't know, just casually disappear before the court date. However, on a terrifying note, the husband's second option when calling the 4 witnesses to his house is taking justice into his own hands. He can actually just kill his wife on the spot and face no punishment, nor require going to court, even if the witnesses didn't see the wife cheating beforehand. Punishment number 6 is marks and tattoos. European medieval period started with the fall of Rome in 476 AD and extended to roughly 1450. Meanwhile, a fun fact, the Americas never experienced a medieval period because a feudal system was never actually established in that hemisphere. In Nathaniel Hawthorne's The Scarlet Letter, protagonist Hester Prynne is marked with a red A to see her as an adulterer. This was practiced in a few regions of medieval Europe, such as Spain, France, even Britain. However, it was reserved for working girls and their keepers and continued well out of the medieval period until the Ancien regime. Women who committed the crime of Puritanism were branded with hot iron to show the world how frivolous they are. The working girls received a P on the arm, the booty, or the forehead, which I feel is a bit vindictive and personal. Meanwhile, the keepers were branded with an M, accompanied by a fleur-de-lis. King Charles IV even made them outlaws, stating that may all girls of joy and public women desolate from our court in said time under pain of whip and mark. After the establishment of the New World, which is out of the medieval period, but as stated, the Americas didn't have one, we see branding laws in colonies more akin to Hawthorne's Scarlet Letter, such as the 1658 Plymouth Law that stated adulterers must mark every garment they own to identify them of their crime. Adulterers seen publicly without their letters were subjected to public whipping and further humiliation. Rule number 5 is the modest dip. Because we're on the topic of acceptable fashions and modesty, a Victorian woman taking a dip at the beach pretty much looked the same as 4 burly men sitting in an ice fishing hut in Alaska. First of all, this was something only middle and upper middle class people could really do, as it required money. You had to rent bathing machines, barges, which looked like outhouses on wheels but were really covered carriages that drove through the shallow water of the beach. There was a hole in the bottom that the ladies could stick their legs into, or sometimes submerge their whole body, but that was ill-advised. Not because the water was filthy, which it was, and riddled with corpses and poison to boot, but because creeps could come swimming up and see your bare legs. Can't afford the traveling outhouse? Well, no beach for you. Rule number 4 is wife sales, a real legal way to obtain a divorce in stuffy Christianized England. Divorce was unpopular, detested, and openly deterred in those days. Seeing as you were discouraged from intercourse with your partner, married them when you barely knew them, and could barely spend time alone with one another, it was a pretty popular request. You would have to sit listening to the clock tick and his nose being clogged but him not blowing it for the 444th night in a row while you disassociate staring into a fireplace. What the hell did people expect? Of course you want out. You don't even know his middle name. Attaining a divorce in the early 1900s was an expensive undertaking, however. So, those who couldn't afford the legal fee sometimes sold their wives to the highest bidder. It was often done with the full consent of the wife, who was usually bought by her family, a new lover, or a female friend. It was an amicable way to say, this was a mistake, get out of my house, good luck and prosper. Rule number 3 is no flirting. As stated, you were really not supposed to flirt, and flirting to the Victorians included eye contact, talking to one another, looking at another person, breathing their air, knowing their name. Maybe the last one is dramatic, but you get my point. You wanted someone, you had to wait until you met them 4 or 5 times, then you could look at them, run into them a couple more times, then maybe request a dance at a ball, and you get one of those a couple times, then maybe you get a sit-down chaperone visit, maybe a walk in the park, and a couple more ball dances. Then you can propose. But even then, a Victorian maiden could not be trusted alone with her fiancé lest her dainty, fluttering hand rest on the arm of her intended and cause an outburst that would inflame the fiancé's uncontrollable base lusts. Even after progressing through several stages of acceptable dating, aka the ball dancing, talking, walking together at a distance, if a man was invited to the woman's home, their acquaintanceship would still have to be under the watchful eye of a chaperone. Single women were never to indulge in behavior with a man that might lead to being kissed or handled in any way. This included strict inspection rules, because I kid you not, men were encouraged to inspect a woman back then. Like many of the stipulations that accompany shipping procedures. How romantic. If a man wanted to admire a necklace, the woman would have to remove it, hand it over for inspection. Under no circumstances was the item to be inspected while she wore it. Now I know where that flirting tactic came from, because guys, y'all love that whole jewelry admiring flirt, and it isn't subtle. And of course, during the chance encounters in one's club or in the park, staring boldly at someone you knew without acknowledging him or her, known as cutting, was the ultimate display of bad flirting manners in Victorian times. Guess they didn't like them bold back then. Rule number 2 is coming out. Not like that. Coming out in Victorian times meant a woman was tired of being in her parents' house, and if she wanted out of it, meant she had to go find a semi-tolerable guy whose house she could move into in return for a cool ring on her left hand. This had to be a whole big announcement, because to attend such events that a woman needed to meet a potential suitor, she required the explicit permission of her mother. Only after stating her intent could the chaperones be organized, because she can't go alone. Think of Bridgerton. Rich families might accompany the announcement with a series of parties or even a royal visit. Middle-class families might hold a celebratory feast. Lower-class families might not formally celebrate the announcement at all. Instead, the young woman just changed her appearance to show availability. This could be putting up her hair, donning a long dress, and accompanying family members to social events like church service, church dinners, festival balls. Coming out was best done during the in-season, a literal term. It meant the 4 months from April to July where the upper-class families up and down the country would send their teenage daughters to London. After flocking there en masse, the upper classes would congregate a series of balls and dances for the purpose of meeting, matching, and reproducing the next generations. At these events, the race was on to find someone with whom to make love. Again, this phrase of whose meaning has changed considerably over time. Making love in the Victorian age meant seeking out someone who might one day come to love you. This was done by eligible bachelors going up to girls' chaperones, giving them a little card, requesting a dance with her. Her dance cards would be stacked in cue order in which the men got their dances, and they were only allowed 3 per woman. End of the night rolls around, and our maiden will choose if she liked a suitor and have her chaperone return the card to indicate, oh yeah buddy, it's on. Rule number 1 is how to travel, aka how not to have fun. Here's your duties when you're traveling as a Victorian lady. Listen up, take notes. Dress appropriately. This is usually a dress similar to the morning gown, lighter and easier to move around in, but most importantly plain and understated with few details. They would accessorize with dark leather gloves, a straw bonnet, and of course, a travel corset, which was apparently said to be much less restrictive. Pick your seat carefully. It was customary for a woman traveling alone to choose a seat either next to another woman or an elderly gentleman. Women traveling alone were seen as prime targets for pickpocketers and thieves. It was usually only done to poor women without chaperone options, but all women, rich or poor, were instructed to keep only a small amount of customary spending cash on their person and give the bulk of their dough to their driver or escort to keep safe. Speak when spoken to, as only men were allowed to spark conversation with a lady, never the opposite way around. Women were expected to respond politely and accept invitations to the refreshment saloon, even if they didn't want to go. That's because of the next rule. Never ever be rude while traveling, especially alone. It was imperative a woman act with the utmost class, even if being accosted by a persistent male passenger. But make sure you don't pester him. If a woman is traveling with a male companion, it's not appropriate to ask him such questions as, when do we get there? How far is it? You know you're making the wrong turn. Yes, you are. I know you are. I've been this way before. Look, that was the wrong way. How much time do you think that wrong turn added? Do you want to stop and grab something too? Yeah, no, strictly forbidden. Can't do that crap. But don't forget, you're also a babysitter to the because if the lady's male chaperone accidentally wandered into designated female compartments, it was her fault for either inviting him into the quarters or not alerting him of the specialized area. And lastly, while traveling, don't check yourself in. If a journey requires a stop at a hotel along the way, the lady would remain in the carriage while the driver escort took care of all the room arrangements, likely because it was unheard of for a woman to make such a decision on her own.
Number 10. Thews or stalks. Gossiping now is always seen as a bothersome and terrible construct where rumors are spread and information is sent from one end to the room to the other, when in actuality the original history of gossiping was used as a survival tool since time. However, due to the trickling events that would occur in the 12th century to the 21st century, gossip has been accompanied by the dangerous stigmatization of women. And with that in mind, they would be accompanied with a crime of humiliation for gossiping by being locked up by the neck and left outside at the mercy of the mocking crowd. The thew was a type of pillory similar to stalks specifically for women, and the woman would be chained to a post by her neck as a punishment for her crime. Unlike men, her hands weren't tied up, and common crimes include annoying your neighbors by talking too much or consummating outside of marriage. As for example, one woman named Anne Morrow in 1777, she was accused of impersonating a man and marrying another woman. She was put in the pillory and an angry crowd stoned her and resulting of her being blind. Number 9. Iron cages. They really didn't like it when women gossiped, or in most cases talked back in the day, especially when she would speak up or just discuss things. But words can only help you unless you speak them, and it's disappointing when people fail to understand that. Women who nagged would have metal spikes forced into their mouths, and the scold bridle was an iron cage for a woman's face, used to punish scolds, women who nagged, gossiped, talked back, or just talked too much. The bridle would be locked onto your head, and the protruding piece of metal covered in spikes would be forced inside your mouth, and every time you moved your tongue, the spikes would lacerate it. Sometimes the bridal woman would be chained to a hook by the fireplace in her home until she had learned her lesson, or she might be led through town wearing the mask to increase her humiliation. Number 8. Duck the scold. Unfortunately, another form of torment and punishment for women being tied to a chair at the end of a long, maneuverable wooden arm and dipped into frigid water. The punishment wasn't designed to be fatal, although sometimes it was, but rather a humiliating spectacle aimed at discouraging whatever behavior participated in it. There were various rituals for silencing women, as they have their roots in fear of women's speech and fear that women will attack other people in their community, that they gossip too much, that their voices were dangerous, and that they may, in extreme circumstances, also be witches. Though the women who ended up being on the ducking stool risked being accused of witchcraft, and the punishment, contrary to popular misconception, wasn't used to determine whether someone was a witch. A separate test, primarily known as the swimming witch, involved throwing a bound victim into a body of water to see if they'd float, a sure sign of guilt in the modern imagination. Subjects who sank were deemed innocent but could still wind up dead if they weren't rescued from the water in time. Few records about the women who were ducked survived. Much more information is available about the ducking stools themselves, their upkeep, about how they were kept into their construction. Number 7. Marking and tattooing. Although in some cultures tattooing isn't seen as a bad thing, but part of their heritage and even a source of pride. But in some cases they would use it as a means of marking an individual for their shame. Nathaniel Hawthorne, The Scarlet Letter, famously marks its protagonist Hester Prynne with a red letter A for adultery for accusations about her behavior circulated. Hawthorne's book is more than fiction, as adulterers were really forced to mark their clothing to identify their crimes. Like Hester Prynne, A or the letters AD as outlined by a Plymouth colony law from 1658, adulterers seen publicly without their letters were subject to public whipping and even further humiliation and social alienation. But keep in mind, Hawthorne was the descendant of the Judge Hathorne, who persecuted the lives of women women who are accused of being witches, and he had such a disdain for his relative that he had changed his last name to distance himself from the relation of Hathorn from Hawthorne with a W. Number 6. Walk of Shame. Like in Game of Thrones, a pretty well-known show, I don't know if you guys heard of it, I'm rewatching it again up to a certain specific season. But there was that scene where Cersei was condemned for her crimes and had that lady yell shame as she rung a bell while Cersei was left parading the streets stripped naked. This is actually based as a form of torment for women, and the Walk of Shame, also known as skimmington or rough music, was a traditional punishment for harlotry or being an overbearing wife. Women were made to walk barefoot through the town or city, sometimes dressed only in their petticoat. The street was filthy and sharp with rough stones, jeering crowds lined up to stare, and minstrels banging basins and pans would accompany the procession, adding to the woman's humiliation. Sometimes the skimmingtons were delivered by the townsfolk rather than the courts, and the accused might be dragged from their bed at night and paraded through the town with the crowd shouting obscene words at her. Unless she was quiet, subdued woman who followed every little thing she was supposed to do, she would be looked down on.
Number 5. Saws for the newlyweds in Germany. People can receive a ton of weird wedding gifts, but in Germany, it is a guarantee that the bride and the groom will receive a beautiful new saw. Yeah, a power tool might not seem like the most beautiful thing to receive on your wedding day, but this tool actually has a very important meaning when it comes to German weddings. It is actually tradition for the bride and groom to saw a massive log together following their wedding ceremony. And since it is a two-person saw and the couple needs to act together to cut the log in half, the challenge is meant to symbolize the strength of the new couple working together and prepare them for the challenges they will face in life. It's also key that the couple is still wearing their wedding attire during the log cutting, which means that those fancy tuxedos and dresses will be covered in wood chips after the ceremony is complete. Now thankfully the log cutting is pretty popular in Germany, so you shouldn't have any problems explaining the wood chips once it's time to return the rental attire. Number 4. Stealing the groom's shoes in India. So in Korea, the groom has his shoes removed for a ceremonial foot beating, but in India, the groom's shoes are likely to be stolen altogether. While some people might think a burglar had broken into the wedding with a desire to steal the shoes, it turns out the real culprits are actually the bride's female friends. It's not really known how this bizarre prank started in the first place, but this is a fairly common and humorous tradition that occurs at Indian weddings. If the groom does not keep a watchful eye on his shoes before the ceremony takes place, there's a good chance they will go missing. The friends will hide the shoes from the groom, who has two options for getting them back. He can either go hunting for them himself and hope he finds them before the ceremony begins, or he can bribe the girls to tell him where they hid the shoes. Considering how embarrassing it would be to show up to your own wedding with no shoes on, your safest bet would probably be to just pay the girls immediately and find out where they hid the shoes. Number 3. The gift of teeth in Fiji. If that one sounds weird to you, that's because it is. Thankfully, it's not human teeth that are being gifted at weddings in Fiji, but it is actually a sperm whale tooth. Before a groom can even think about advancing to the wedding ceremony in this country, he must first ask permission from the father of the bride-to-be. However, just asking for the father's blessing is not enough, and a grand gesture must also be made for the groom to earn the respect of his potential father-in-law. A traditional proposal on the island of Fiji involves the groom and his family presenting the bride's father with a giant tooth from a sperm whale, as this is considered a sacred item in the nation. While this tradition is generally more popular in rural areas, it is still very prevalent all over the country. However, obtaining a sperm whale tooth does not sound like such an easy task. The groom will more than likely have to find someone who is selling a tooth, and they can sometimes cost hundreds of dollars. Add that onto the already expensive wedding ring, and proposals on the island nation really start to add up. Number 2. Brides dancing for money in Cuba. The title of this one definitely sounds a little unholy and probably wouldn't be very well received in many countries around the world, but this is an old tradition at Cuban weddings. It is actually common for other men to dance with the bride at her own wedding in Cuba. However, it's not as simple as just walking up to her and busting a move. In Cuba, any man aside from the groom who wishes to share a dance with the bride will have to come up with some cash if he wants to join in on the fun. The strangest part about this tradition though is that the money is not just handed over in a traditional manner. The men who end up dancing with the bride will actually pin the cash to the bride's dress, and by the end of the dancing festivities, she will be covered in money. While it's pretty obvious to see why this might not look so good in other countries, the cash that the bride earns from the dancing directly supports the newlyweds' honeymoon plans. So it is actually in the best interest of the groom to encourage his friends to dance with his new wife on their special day. And at number 1, spitting on the bride in Kenya. Alright, now the money thing doesn't sound like such a weird idea. This is pretty much exactly what it sounds like, but the meaning behind it is actually very good. And instead of the bride having money pinned to her, Kenyans believe it is a blessing to have the father of the bride spit on her. This is a very old tradition in Kenya that dates all the way back to the early Maasai people, who believed that spitting on someone was a sign of respect. So in this case, the father of the bride spits on his own daughter to show his respect and congratulations for the start of her new married life. It's definitely interesting to see how different acts are treated around the world, because a foreigner who was attending a Kenyan wedding would probably think there was a terrible incident unfolding if they saw someone spit on the bride. There are many other wedding traditions from the Maasai tribe, including the groom trading animals in exchange for the bride, but the spitting seems to be the most popular in modern times.
Number 10, Clara and Katerina Morova. Clara was actually a very loving and acceptable mother to her two sons, Andrej and Jacob, where they would take trips and summer camps, and she would play with her sons all the time. It wasn't until a new child entered their home by the name of Annika, and Clara and her sister Katerina were part of a cult named the Grail Movement. When Annika came into the picture, it was under the support of Katerina and Clara's sister, where she was told by Katerina that Annika was a 13-year-old who escaped from a trafficking gang that had physically harmed her. Annika was also apparently very sick and suffered many illnesses, which gained Clara's sympathy. Clara wanted to adopt Annika after bonding with her so quickly, and even had a mystery doctor tell her how to take care of Annika. This same doctor told Clara that her sons were a problem and needed to be cured from their evil spirits. It was then Clara would do an equivalent amount of violating and harmful things to her biological sons, like shock therapy, making them eat their own flesh, dunk their heads in water, as well as invite others to her cult to do the same. Annika would also lie to make the aggression towards the boys even worse. It was until a man named Edward had a CCTV camera for his newborn baby when Clara was caught in the act. Clara and her sisters were caught, and it turns out Annika was actually a 33-year-old woman posing as a 13-year-old named Barbara, who had a disease that made her look younger than she actually was. She was eventually arrested as well, which, if you've seen the movie Orphan, it's actually based where this was from. Clara got 9 years in prison, and her sister got 10 years, since her sister Katerina actually knew who Barbara was the whole time. Number 9, Cordelia Bodkins. However you were in your relationships or affairs, be aware of ex-lovers who might never want to let you go. Cordelia met her lover, a highly regarded reporter, John Preston Dunning, when he was bicycling in San Francisco. At that point, she was 41 years old, 9 years his senior, and although they were already married to their own partners, John was very smitten by Cordelia. John eventually was left by his wife, who discovered the infidelity, but for Cordelia, her husband was pretty cool with it. John also had issues with gambling debts, and he was let go from his job because he was a heavy drinker, so he had to move in with Bodkins' hotel. Their affair lasted for about 3 years, but ended when John was rehired to cover the Spanish-American War. When he left San Fran, he told Cordelia, "Baby girl, I am not coming back," and he even reconciled with his wife because he was leaving for Cuba, where he helped survivors of the Spanish battleships during the Battle of Santiago de Cuba. Cordelia, however, didn't care for this and wanted him back, so she sent anonymous letters to his wife Elizabeth detailing her husband's affairs. Unfortunately, it got worse when Elizabeth opened a box of candies addressed to her and her sister with the words, "With love to yourself and baby, passionately and fond of candy." Elizabeth and her older sister died from arsenic poisoning, and their father was able to decipher their handwriting from the previous letters to Cordelia, and Cordelia went to life imprisonment. Number 8, Mary Sue Hubbard. It was always in the 1950s where a lot of crap happened that led us to the chaos we know today. And for Mary Sue Hubbard, she is also known as the wife of the founder of Church of Scientology, Ron Hubbard. She was sentenced in the federal court in the 1980s to 4 years in prison for her role in the conspiracy to plant church spies in government agencies, steal government documents, and bug at least one government meeting. She told U.S. District Judge Norma Holloway Johnson that she sincerely and publicly apologized for her actions. Johnson ordered Hubbard, who had been freed pending appeal for her 1979 conviction in the case, to turn herself into the federal officials in 3 weeks, during the time in 3 weeks to begin serving her sentence. Hubbard, who lived in Los Angeles at the time, was the last of 11 church leaders who were indicted in the conspiracy in August 1978 to go to prison. The indictments came after the FBI raided the church headquarters back then in Los Angeles in 1977, and the raids were said to be the largest ever conducted by the FBI at the time. Documents introduced in courts by prosecutors in 1979 contended the operatives of the church initiated numerous break-ins at government official offices, including the Justice Departments, and they secretly placed a listening device in the Internal Revenue Service's conference room, and all in a apparent effort to combat what the church alleged government harassment. Judge Johnston commented that she didn't know whether the government had harassed the church, but she quotes, "Even if I assumed there was harassment, I still can't accept what you did as excusable." Number 7, Natalia Guera. Speaking of religious cults, Natalia Guera was definitely part of one where she had sacrificed her own 2-day-old infant and burning him to death as part of a satanic ritual. She was finally apprehended by police after evading capture for 2 years. Just 2 days after giving birth, Natalia agreed to have a baby, Jesus, quote-unquote, killed after the leader of Antares de la Luz cult and the father of the child, Raymond Gustavo Castillo Gaete, declared that the infant to be an antichrist and that the sacrifice would help prevent the end of the world on December 21st, 2012. Natalia had previously stated in her defense that she was drugged at the time of the murder, but a forensic psychologist declared that the members were not under the influence when the sacrifice was carried out. After her sentence, Natalia managed to flee and was on the run for 2 years. Investigators noted that she had lived in different houses and even changed her identity in order to evade capture. The police also noted that after being apprehended, she did not show remorse and claimed that she was manipulated by the cult and was therefore innocent. Number 6. Aileen Wuornos. Aileen Wuornos was a convicted serial killer as she targeted only men as an adult worker. She had up to 7 victims and would target specifically motorists, men who would meet her on the road as she acted as a hitchhiker. She was incarcerated at the Florida Department of Corrections BCI death row for women, and she tried to appeal to the US Supreme Court, which was later denied. At that point, she dismissed her legal counsel and terminated all pending appeals. She then would go off to say, in quotes, "I killed those men, I robbed them as cold as ice, and I'd do it again. There is no chance in keeping me alive or anything because I'll kill again, and I hate crawling through my system. I am so sick of hearing this she's crazy stuff. I've been evaluated so many times. I'm competent, sane, and I'm trying to tell the truth. I'm the one who seriously hates human life and would kill again." After extreme mistreatment she suffered while imprisoned and the inhumane management given to her by the officers, in her final interview she expressed to the media in quote, "You sabotaged me, society, and the cops, and the system. An attacked woman got executed and was used for books and movies and so on." Her final on-camera words were, "Thanks a lot, society, for railroading my ass." She was later executed by lethal injection. Number 5. Prison life. Being accused of being an idle and disorderly woman seems like a very vague and inconvenient statement today as it holds no worthy of prosecution, but for these women of these times, you would definitely go to jail for that. These roughly defined offenses were common charges against women in the 18th century. At least in some records of the names of these women have survived, there are 2 on the list who are silently identified, only known as an unknown women, cannot give any account of herself, and the other being accused of being a vagrant and an idiot. Which, of course, being an idiot isn't a crime unless you're doing something idiotic that hurts another person. Then yeah, I guess being an idiot is a crime. It is possible that up to 2/3 of prisoners in the House of Corrections, like the one at the prison called the Wakefield House of Correction, were female. Beating hemp was the usual form of hard labor, as well as if the women refused to comply or being able to commit to tasks, whipping and beatings were also a commonplace, particularly to those who convicted of vagrancy, lewd conduct, and night walking. Number 4. Domestic harm. This is sort of stemming back to the whole marriage thing in number 10, as it basically ties in on how horrible life was being a woman in the Victorian era, or just being a woman in general in any historical time. With these sacrifices and determinations of these women, as they ensured the women like me were able to gain access slowly but surely to equal rights, but sadly when it comes to marriage for some of these women, they're also at risk of being in harmful relationships that were extremely normalized at the time. Violence against women and the lack of protection was common as there were no laws for the physical violations they had to endure. After all, when you got married, everything you owned belonged to your husband, and so did your body, with or without consent. Domestic violence was an issue that captivated the Victorian imagination due to the unprecedented visibility that domestic harm began to receive in the press and the emergence of an ongoing debate during the 1840s and the 1850s. Domestic violence was an issue that captivated the Victorian imagination due to the unprecedented visibility that domestic harm began to receive in the press and the emergence of an ongoing debate during the 1840s and 1850s about the domestic harm and other marriage issues that affected women. Like all laws that slowly opened gateways to other clauses, the 1828 Offences Act that targets working class violence helped a cultural shift on the subject, and domestic violence became a topic to the public. Number 3. The angel of the house. Or the angel in the house. When it came to the liberation, it all stemmed with the women's rights groups fought for equality and over time made strides in attaining rights and privileges. However, many Victorian women endured their husbands' control and even cruelty, including sensual violence, verbal abuse, and economic deprivation. And there's no way out of it as it got worse, as a man named Coventry Patmore published a book called Angel in the House. It consisted of poems and the ideal Victorian marriage, and although it came from a place of grief at the loss of his first wife, the book had suddenly become a staple in women's behaviors and marriages, and then became a standard of their status. A woman's proper role was to love, honor, and obey her husband, as her marriage vows stated. A wife's place in the family hierarchy was secondary to her husband, but far from being considered unimportant. A wife's duty to tend to her husband and properly raise her children were considered crucial cornerstones of social stability by the Victorians. Representations of ideal wives were abundant in Victorian culture, providing women of their role models, and the Victorian ideal of the tirelessly patient, sacrificing wife is what depicted the angel in the house. And for these middle-class women, mimicking the angel in the house gave them more opportunities to find a successful match in marriage. Number 2, the House General. The House General, and a term coined in 1861 by Isabella Beeton in her influential manual, Mrs. Beeton's Book of Household Management. Because for women they needed a manual on how to be a good wife, a good woman, and a good so on and so forth. Here she explained that the mistress of the house is comparable to the commander of an army or the leader of an enterprise. To run a respectable household and secure the happiness and comfort and well-being of her family, she must perform her duties intellectually and thoroughly. For example, she had to organize, delegate, and instruct her servants, which was not an easy task as many of them were not reliable. Isabella Beeton's upper-class readers may also have a large complement of domestics, a staff requiring supervisions by mistress of the house. Beeton's advised her readers to maintain a housekeeping account book to track spending. She recommends entries and checking the balance monthly, but also keep in mind this is the same lady who told people to put borax in bread to save money. This may not seem like a big punishment for some viewers, but if you were told that you needed a manual to how to live your life so you wouldn't be kicked out of society, that's not something that's a preference today, is it? And number 1, Asylum. Now, if you're a woman who was out of the realms and just didn't want to be part of society like everyone else, maybe just suffered a series of mental health issues or even just looked ugly, you might find yourself in an asylum. They had such ridiculous reasons to lock up a woman, as I mentioned in the prison section on this list. From being a vagrant, disorderly, or whatever the case was, you'd go to prison, or even more so, to the asylum. For some families, if they just didn't know what to do with you, they just toss you into the asylum for not being complicit. In an investigation by a very passionate and amazing writer named Nellie Bly, she had experienced firsthand on the field of the mistreatments, the devastating conditions, and harm patients had to endure. In her report published in 1887 and later published in the book 10 Days in the Madhouse, it caused such a sensation it prompted the asylum to implement reforms and shed the light on the significant impact on American culture.